morning, everyone. Welcome to our very first U.S. history virtual class of this period of school closure. Today is Thursday, April 16th, 2020. I, of course, am Mr. Quinn, and today we are going to be covering the Cold War. So a few logistical notes. First, I hope that all of you are doing well. I miss all of you. I wish that we could be doing this in person, doing this in our classroom. However, given the circumstances, we're going to try and have as engaging of a class online as possible. So the way this works, this is the pre-recorded video. Every week I'll post one of these to Google Classroom along with 2 assignments. You have 2 days to complete those 2 assignments. And by 2 days, I mean 2 business days. So you have until Monday to submit the 2 assignments for U.S. history. So I'll post this video and the assignments around 10 a.m. And then at noon, I will be holding a virtual online class, a virtual online office hour for any student who has me for U.S. history. So that could mean that you're in 4A, 4B, or 5B. That is not mandatory. What that is that is a chance for anyone who is interested in talking a bit more about the material, gaining some clarification about the material, to go ahead and join, and we'll talk about it. So essentially, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Cold War in this presentation, and then I hope that some of you are interested enough to join at noon, and we'll talk about the Cold War some more. And then every day I'm available from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. to answer your questions via email. And if you need any additional office hours set up, please just let me know. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. So we're going to be talking about the Cold War from 1949 to 1990. That is a long period of time. That is over 40 years. Ask some adults in your life when they were born. Odds are they were born during the Cold War period. So the Cold War is a huge part of U.S. history, and it picks up just where we left off when we left school. So we're talking about the 2 major superpowers in the world after World War II. We have the Soviet Union, or the USSR, on one side, and you have the United States on the other. And this is a battle between ideas, really. And so on one side you have the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's economic system is communism. And we'll talk about what a communist economic system looks like in one moment. On the other side, the US is a capitalist economic system. On the other hand, in terms of political systems, the USSR is a dictatorship, and the political system for the US is a democracy. Please, you don't want to get economic system and political system confused here. They go hand in hand, but they are 2 different things. So when we talk about economic system, we're talking about capitalism, communism. When we talk about political system, we're talking about democracy and dictatorship. So what do these economic systems mean, right? You've probably heard both of these words before, but what does it mean? So on this slide, what I've tried to do here is you have a continuum. On one side, you have no government regulation of the economy at all, meaning that the government allows business to do whatever it wants. On the other side, you have full government regulation of the economy, meaning that the government controls everything. There is no free enterprise. It is all about competition between businesses, and may the best survive. And so where would you place communism, capitalism, socialism, and the US today on this line? Essentially, communism and capitalism are on the 2 opposite ends. So Capitalism is no government regulation in the economy. A true capitalist system allows business to reign free, allows business to compete freely, and there's no government involvement in the economy. We were like this early on in the United States. However, government regulation increased as we got to the progressive era, and then especially the Great Depression and New Deal era that we covered this year in class, because of some of the concerns that were brought up during the Gilded Age, going all the way back to the fall. On the opposite side, you have communism, right? So if capitalism is no government regulation of the economy, communism is full government regulation of the economy, meaning that the government controls everything. The government, which is there's a lot of political theory and economic theory that goes into communism, but the very simple way that I think it would be best to cover it in terms of our purposes today would just be to say communism is full government regulation of the economy. Socialism, on the other hand, socialism is on the full government regulation side, but it's not all the way at the end, right? This is a continuum. You don't have to be all the way at the end. And so if communism, capitalism all the way at the end, socialism I put right here, right? It's definitely on the full government regulation side, but that does not mean that there is not some free enterprise. And then the U.S. today. Where's the U.S. today? I put the U.S. today on the lesser government regulation side, but close to the middle. Okay, and this is probably something that could be debated by many people. There is a lot of debate over what role the government should play in our economy, but this is where I would put the U.S. today. We are a capitalist society. We are a capitalist economic system. But we do have a good deal of government intervention, of government regulation of the economy, because we have proven in the Gilded Age and throughout our history that no government regulation typically hurts your most vulnerable workers. That being said, there are a lot of people today that promote that the U.S. should be farther over here, right? That the U.S. should be farther towards the greater government regulation side. And that's one of the biggest arguments right now in the current presidential race. So hopefully this helps give you a basic understanding of the economic systems we're talking about. So now, what's the deal between communism and capitalism, right? President Harry S. Truman, who's the president of the U.S. at the end of World War II, he has this policy of containment, which simply means the U.S. wants to stop the spread of communism to other nations. In other words, contain communism. Because the U.S. also believes in this thing called the domino theory, which, if you've ever played with dominoes, you know that if one falls over, what happens to all the others? They continue to fall over in succession, right? One hits the other, hits the other, hits the other, hits the other, and then all the dominoes have fallen. And so that's what the U.S. was afraid of. That's what both President Truman and then many presidents who followed Truman thought about. The thing is, the Soviet Union thought very similarly with capitalism. Right? And so the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism, wanted to spread their ideas throughout the world. The U.S. wanted to spread their ideas throughout the world, both stopping the other. You're going to find that in this unit, in this presentation, in the activities we're going to be doing this week and next week, you're going to see a lot of government propaganda on both sides, from the U.S. and from the Soviet Union, because both want to exert their influence over the rest of the world as much as possible. And if someone out there is going, hey, that sounds like imperialism, then you would be correct. This falls right into the idea of imperialism that we've talked about throughout the school year. And you see in this political cartoon, Uncle Sam is trying to reach as far as possible, and over here, the Soviet Union bear is trying to reach as far as possible. And up here in the top corner, you see a piece of U.S. government propaganda, right? It's your choice. Where do you draw the line against communist aggression? So the U.S. had this policy of containment, following the ideas of the domino theory. All right, so there's this thing called the Iron Curtain, and this is something students always get confused about. Is the Iron Curtain physical? Is it an actual thing, or is it figurative? Right? The answer is sort of both. Okay. So Winston Churchill, hopefully you remember that name. He was Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II and the immediate period afterwards. He called the divide between communism and capitalism in Europe the Iron Curtain. And so you see in this map here, this white line is what we would call the Iron Curtain, right? On one side you have all these capitalist nations. On the other side you have all these communist nations. That's not a physical divide, right? That just so happens that you have this Eastern Bloc that is capitalist and this Western Bloc that is communist. However, when we talk about the physical divide, one of the things that happened in Germany following World War II is after the fall of Hitler, after the fall of Germany in World War II, Germany was divided up between the Allied powers, right? And so here you have France, Great Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, right? So the Allies divide up Germany. And not only do they divide up Germany, but they specifically divide up Berlin. So the city of Berlin in Germany was divided up into these 4 zones. And you had the US, French, and British side, which is capitalist, which is democratic, and then you have the Soviet side. And between these two, you had the actual Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall is brought up by most people to be a physical manifestation, a physical example of what this Iron Curtain in Europe that Winston Churchill talked about was. And the Berlin Airlift, which is a famous event, one of you did a presentation on it for our Cold War presentations. The Berlin Airlift was essentially the Soviet Union blocked off travel, and so the U.S. and the Allies would have to bring in these planes over the Soviet part of Germany and of Berlin to bring supplies, to bring food to the eastern part. And so the Iron Curtain is both figurative but also physical when we talk about the Berlin Wall. And here is the Berlin Wall, right? And I did a little hashtag Throwback Thursday to our museum field trip, right? Those of you who joined us in December to go to the museum, you saw a piece of the Berlin Wall, right? Not the whole Berlin Wall. The whole Berlin Wall is huge, massive, but a part of the Berlin Wall was in the museum, and you got to see it back in December, right? And you see on one side there's all this graffiti, all this street art, and on the other side it's very, very bland, very intimidating. And then you also see this big watchtower, right, where guards would stand on patrol. There was no passage. There was no passage through the Berlin Wall throughout the Cold War period, right? Or no free passage, I should say. You had to definitely have permission. And we'll talk later on about the moment the Berlin Wall fell, and it was quite a significant, magical moment in world history. So yeah. Hopefully this ties back to what you got to see at the museum field trip in December. So, the Red Scare. What's the scariest color? If you talk to Senator Joseph McCarthy, he would say red. And once again, here's where that government propaganda comes back, right? Is this tomorrow? American America under communism and all the flames and government officials strangling regular people or prisoners breaking out and assaulting regular people, the U.S. flag on fire, right? Definitely government propaganda. Here you have the Red Menace is real, report all suspected communist activity. And so lots of propaganda promoting against communism, promoting against the quote-unquote Reds, as Joseph McCarthy and others would say. And this is Joseph McCarthy. He's a prominent senator at the time, and we'll talk about why on the next slide. So Joseph McCarthy, essentially, the Red Scare was already a thing, and the Red Scare is essentially this widespread fear that communists were working to destroy the American way of life. And the Red Scare is synonymous with Senator Joseph McCarthy, and based on this idea of McCarthyism, which is essentially McCarthy would go around and search for communists and accuse people with no real basis that they were communist. Right? Think about learning about the Salem witch trials back in U.S. History Part 1. This is very similar, right? No real basis for the accusations, but if you were accused to be a communist, your entire life could be torn apart, right? So much so that the House of Representatives even had HUC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a congressional committee that investigated communist influence in government agencies and the Hollywood movie industry. A lot of people were accused of being Soviet spies. Were they? A couple were, right? A couple were, but there was not the widespread communist influence that McCarthy was promoting, or that others were promoting too. I don't want you to think that McCarthy was the only one. This was a very widespread thing. Many people in government, in Hollywood, throughout life, got accused of being communist, and their entire livelihoods were destroyed. Two of the probably most significant examples, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were put to death, who were executed, and the Hollywood 10. I'll let you look up those cases on your own, or maybe we can talk about them some more at noon for those who want to join. If you want to learn more about McCarthyism, I think this is a good, I believe it's about a 5-minute video that talks about what is McCarthyism and how did it happen, right? Why did so many people believe these accusations, which many times had no credibility to them, were just based on fear-mongering? So, anywho, why is it called a Cold War, right? This 40-year conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is called the Cold War, but why? How's it a Cold War? Did they all have to wear jackets? No. It's because the two major superpowers never fought directly. Right? In a traditional war, in a hot war, quote unquote, you have two big powers using military weapons to fight each other, right? And the war lasts a few years, and it's direct conflict. A Cold War, because the US and the Soviet Union never had direct conflict. But they were at conflict for 40 years of our history, right? But they competed in other ways, right? So we had the arms race, the space race, and this battle for imperial power, which oftentimes found itself working out through proxy wars. Examples of these proxy wars are both the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And essentially what proxy war means is it's when the two main superpowers backed people who were fighting in the war, but the US and the USSR were not directly fighting in those wars. They were backing other sides and helping those other sides to battle. So it was at no point were the US and the USSR directly at war with each other, but there were several wars tied up in this 40-year Cold War conflict. And we're going to talk about a bit more about the Korean War if you want to join at noon during the office hour. And next week, our full topic actually will be the Vietnam War. So arms race, what does that mean? An arms race is essentially both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, both wanted to build up as much military advantage as possible. They wanted to build up as much equipment, as much power as possible with the military. However, what ended up happening is both sides built up all this military power and almost none of it were used, right? And this is because of this thing called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Essentially, the thing was both sides had such an arsenal of weapons, had such a collection of weapons, that if either side used it, especially since after the US used the atomic bombs at the end of World War II in Japan, nuclear weapons were now the greatest fear, right? A nuclear war was the greatest fear. And so both the US and the Soviet Union were capable of engaging in nuclear war, but they knew that if they did engage in nuclear war, it would be the end of the world as we know it. Okay? So essentially, this 40-year conflict is the US and the Soviet Union on the brink of war, but not actually pulling the trigger, not actually engaging in the war. And that's what we call brinksmanship, right? And I think this political cartoon is a good example, right? Both sides have these giant bombs behind them, right? Except the bombs say, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. And both sides say that. And then what are the two sides throwing at each other? They're throwing bows and arrows, right? And so both sides have this nuclear power that could be used to devastate the other, but they also know that if nuclear war erupts, it's going to be the end of the world. It's going to be the end of both superpowers as we know it, because between the actual devastation from the nuclear weapons throughout the world and the nuclear fallout, neither country would survive. So that idea of mutually assured destruction and the policy of brinksmanship, going to the brink of war but not actually breaking out into nuclear war, is essentially what characterized the entire 40-year conflict. And to talk about this fear of atomic power, it's nuclear power, is one of my favorite things. And I truly wish that we were able to be in class to watch this together, because I love watching the looks on student faces as you watch this video. So I absolutely encourage you to watch this video that I've put in the PowerPoint of Bert the Turtle teaching you how to duck and cover. It is one of the most ridiculous things you will see in your life, and it was an actual drill that students had to do in school, which is they were shown this video from Bert the Turtle, and then they had to get under their desks whenever they had duck and cover drills, with the idea being that if you stop, you duck, and you cover yourself under, let's say, a desk, that you would be protected from nuclear war. If part of you is saying that doesn't seem quite right, you're correct. Watch the video, watch Bert the Turtle. You will not be disappointed. And hopefully we can talk about that at noon as well. So also the US and the Soviet Union competed in the space race. And essentially the space race is what it sounds like. It's a race for space. Both the US and the Soviet Union were trying to collect as much technology as possible and be the first to explore space. If you want more on the space race, I have a video here. I also have an article that outlines 6 of the key events in the space race. Of course, the space race concludes really with the U.S. fulfilling its promise to put a man on the moon. So if you're interested in the space race, I strongly encourage watching this quick video covering the space race. We're taking a look at this article. And then imperial influence and proxy wars, right? The US and the Soviet Union both exerting their influence over the rest of the world, trying to spread their philosophy and stop the other. Examples of this were the Korean War, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which one of your assignments today is a Cuban Missile Crisis game. And the reason why I picked this assignment is I think it's kind of fun. And also, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest moment we've ever come to full-on nuclear war. That was the moment. That was the most intense moment of the Cold War where we truly almost came to nuclear war, direct nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. Then we have the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about more next week, and other revolutions and political assassinations throughout Central America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And so this imperial influence of the US and the Soviet Union really did span most of the globe. So while you're doing the Cuban Missile Crisis activity that I've assigned to you, I want you to just keep these questions in mind, right? And you're going to answer them during the reflection activity that's up on Google Classroom. But who are the leaders involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis? What was the conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Why was the Cuban Missile Crisis a significant event? And how could the Cuban Missile Crisis have been avoided? And we can talk more about the Cuban Missile Crisis at our office hour today as well. To give you an idea of just how long the Cold War lasted, here are all the presidents who oversaw the Cold War. We go from Harry S. Truman in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the 33rd president, all the way to the 41st president, George H.W. Bush, who was president from 1989 to 1993. So you have Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and H.W. Bush. Ask some adults in your life who was president when they were born. Odds are they're going to say one of these people, right? I want you to realize the Cold War, if many of you were born in the early 2000s, the Cold War was only 10 to 15 years before you were born, right? I was born in 1996, right? The Cold War ended just a few years before I was born, right? Some people argue whether the end is officially 1990 or 1991. Some people argue that the Cold War has never ended, but most people agree that it ends in the early 90s under George H.W. Bush's presidency. And so I'm not talking about ancient history here. The Cold War is very much something that people alive today experience and that shapes our world a lot today. And we'll talk more about that influence later. But here are your Cold War presidents. And then also leaders of the Soviet Union. I thought it would be fitting if I was going to show you the Cold War presidents to also show you the different leaders of the Soviet Union. If you're interested in looking through the workbook has a lot of resources on the Cold War that you can read about it more. Also, there are plenty of great videos online. Once again, I wish that we could spend more time on this in class, but we're in the situation we're in. I also think this photo is one of the most significant in U.S. and world history, honestly. You have, at the Potsdam Conference, you have Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Harry Truman, President of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, of course, Premier of the Soviet Union. Truly one of the most famous photos in world history. So, how does the Cold War end? Stay tuned. Next week we'll cover the Vietnam War and social unrest in the United States that occurred during this Cold War period. But for now, go ahead, work on the assignments. You have a reading and questions to complete about the Cold War, and then you also have the Cuban Missile Crisis game, which I've posted both to Google Classroom. And also, if you want to spend a few minutes, you can take a look at one of my favorite songs, Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, which covers U.S. and world history during the Cold War period, and also questions human morality, really. And who knows, this song may come up again. It's a bit of tradition to share it in the class. But more on that later. I hope that some of you will join me at 12 noon today, Thursday, April 16th, to talk more about this. Thank you so much for joining. I'm available to help you with any questions you have on the work, and I will see you all next Thursday to discuss the Vietnam War, social unrest, and I hope to see some of you once again today at noon for that virtual class office hour. Have a great day, folks.